So the next form of price discrimination we're going to talk about is third degree or segmented price discrimination. And we said, perfect price discrimination is pretty much impossible. Second degree price discrimination is much more possible and fairly common, although there can be problems with it. Third degree or segmented price discrimination is fairly common. The key with segmented price discrimination is that you're trying to segment the market into different groups, but it has to be an observable characteristic, right? And it has to be something not only that you can observe, but that you can enforce. And so the example that they sort of start with in the book is a ski resort. And so these were actual prices that the Mount Bachelor Ski Resort had in 2010, where a full adult price for a season pass was $999. But then they had lots of different other prices as well. So seniors 65 to 69 were $539. 70 plus was $249. Young adult was $439. Teens were $319. Youth was $189, and under 6 was only $29. So for one thing, age you can identify, right? You can have, you might have trouble between, a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old, or a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. But for the most part, for adults, you can just ask them for ID. And so you can do that. And so the key is obviously that they believe that these groups have different willingness to pay, right? They have different demand curves. And so that's what we're going to want to think about is, all right, well, how much more profit can they get by charging these different prices than if they charged a uniform price? So we're going to do just a really quick example with that. So we've got adults that are listed by A and children C. And so our adult inverse demand curve is 12 minus QA, and the child inverse demand curve is 6 minus QC. And then the long run average cost and marginal cost we're going to assume is the same and is equal to 2. And most of the time I think we can assume it's the same, although there might be instances where it might cost more or less to serve one segment than the other, and you would have to take that into account. And so first we're going to think about where a monopolist would charge a single price. The problem with that is that we have these two different demand curves, right? And so we have to add up the demand curves. And so obviously at a price above $6, kids are not paying, right? Their maximum willingness to pay was 6. And so we need, from above that point, it's just going to be the adult demand curve. But then once we get to a price below 6, then they are willing to pay, and so we have to add that up. So we have this kinked demand curve where above 6 we have P equals 12 minus Q. That's just the adult demand curve. And then after, below a price of 6, we have P equals 18 minus 2Q. And so we get this kink right at Y here, and then a flatter demand curve because of the 2 there, because we added up the Q and the Q. So, all right, we've got a kinked demand curve. That means we're going to have a kinked marginal revenue curve as well. In fact, a discontinuous marginal revenue curve. And what happens here is that we've got the marginal revenue curve from the adults and then the marginal revenue curve from the two of them together, but a constant marginal cost curve. So we've got the marginal cost curve intersecting the marginal revenue curve twice. And there's no real easy way to do this other than just calculating the profit from each intersection, right? So if we go with the first one at E1, we're going to set quantity equal to 5. We're going to go up to the demand curve. We're going to set price equal to 7. And then we can calculate profit. It's just going to be 5 times 5, or 25. And then if we go to E2, the second place where the marginal revenue curve intersects the marginal cost curve, then we're going to have a quantity of 7 and a price of 5.5. And so now our profit is going to be 24.5. So actually in this case, E1 is optimal, and we're going to set a price of 7, which means that we're only going to get adults, right? We're not going to get any children. And so you're like, all right, well, that's too bad, because we know some people would bring their children and pay for them. So what if we charge them separately, right? What if we were able to segment the market? So if we're able to segment the market, and remember the key here is that you're able to distinguish the two groups, then you're just a monopolist, right? You're a monopolist in each market. You can set the monopoly price for adults, and you can set the monopoly price for children. Now, we actually already solved the monopoly price for adults. That's what E1 was in the last slide. So we know that profit is 25. And in the children's market, marginal revenue would just be 6 minus 2Q. We set that equal to 2. We get quantity equals 2, price equals 4, and our profit is 4. So in this case, with price discrimination, our profits are able to increase from 25 to 29. And consumer surplus for adults remains unchanged, right? Because the amount that we charge to adults is unchanged. But now with price discrimination, we have 2 children entering the resort that weren't there before. And so actually consumer surplus for children has increased. So in this case, because of price discrimination, we've actually increased consumer surplus, right? And you can think of a lot of examples like that where, you know, especially as college students, you might not buy something if you had to pay the full price, but because of price discrimination, because they offer, say, a student discount, you do buy it, and therefore you get some consumer surplus. Obviously, we're comparing it with a monopoly, not a perfect competition, but in this case, it does increase total surplus. So the firm is going to, I mean, as we saw, right, we saw those like 6 different prices for the Mount Bachelor Ski Resort. And the idea is that you charge the higher price for those with higher demand or more inelastic demand. And this is generally what we see, especially with age-based price discrimination, is that, you know, sort of prime age working adults pay the most, students and kids pay less, and seniors pay less. It's usually not quite as segmented as the Mount Bachelor Ski Resort. There might be, you know, 3 prices rather than 6, but it's not uncommon. A similar argument can apply to discount coupons, right, which lets consumers get a reduced price, but it takes time and effort to clip the coupons, and so they're going to appeal more to price-sensitive consumers who have a more elastic demand curve than those who have a less elastic demand curve.